So in many ways, virtual currencies might just give existing currencies and monetary policy a run for their money, a run for their money, a run for their money, a run for their money. So in many ways, virtual currencies might just give existing currencies and monetary policy a run for their money. The best response by central bankers is to continue running effective monetary policy while being open to fresh ideas, new demands, new technologies as economies and technologies evolve. So while I completely agree with Minouche that you don't swim twice in the same water, yet you have to be aware that the waters are likely to change, and central banks have to adapt to those changes. And yet, why might citizens hold virtual currencies rather than those physical dollars, physical euros, or physical sterlings? Because it may one day be easier and safer than obtaining paper bills, especially in remote regions, and because virtual currencies could actually become more stable. Instead, citizens may one day prefer virtual currencies, since they potentially offer the same cost and convenience as cash, no settlement risks, no clearing delays, no central registration, no intermediary to check accounts and identities. If privately issued currencies remain risky and unstable, citizens may even call on central banks to provide digital forms of legal tender. So when the new service economy comes knocking on the Bank of England's door, will you welcome it inside? Will you serve tea? Or will you offer financial liquidity? Or all of the above? Governor, dear Mark, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Mark, I think you've been way too kind in your introduction, and if I have any credit is trying to lead and inspire a group of incredibly talented, open-minded and honest people on the issues that are of interest to the IMF and hopefully of service to the international community, which is our membership. So I pay tribute to them, and I certainly share with them the very kind compliments that you've paid in your introduction. So this is a moment to celebrate 20 years of independence of the Bank of England, during which the bank has been a stabilizing force, but also a source of inspiration around the world, inspiring others, not least because of your leadership and your guidance, Mark. It's also a moment to learn from our experience, build on the progress that have been made, and look into the future. And my proposal at this point in time is to look into the next 20 years. So I would like to express my gratitude to the Bank of England and to you, Mark, for having given me that space of free thinking and liberty to actually look forward into what it could be like in a few years' time. Now, this morning, many of you have come up Fleet Street, which always feels like a journey back into history. In the Middle Ages, that street was an important center of commerce. Most of it has gone online. By the 19th century, the street, George would have confirmed that, was home to ticket machines and reporters racing each other to make the evening papers. Well, that world too has largely moved online. And much has changed for the bankers and policymakers here in the City of London. But that is only the beginning. So I suggest that we spin the hands of Big Ben forward to 2040. Don't think about how old you'll be. Forget it. And let's catch a glimpse of their world, our world. We might just see that cars have disappeared because people are moving about in hovering drones that I will call pods, which elegantly avoid each other in the morning hours. One of those pods actually carries the central bank governor, who recently started her second term. Thank you, Adam, for quoting so many women, massive talent of English literature. As part of her morning routine, she swipes through a hologram of new videos curated by a digital assistant before arriving at Threadneedle Street. The governor disembarks, walks up the columned facade, opens the door and... Oh, we could have a little poll at this point in time. Will she meet people? Will she meet machine? What will they look like? Highly robotized? A lot of brain power? Artificial intelligence? Are there economists sitting at their desk? Or, as is currently the case in the most sophisticated central banks, some economists, but a few others from different fields of research? Are they debating policy choices around the table? Are they setting rates? Are they planning on issuing money? So how will fintech change central banking over the next generation? That's what I would like to touch on. And it's really touching on it because each of those three topics that I would like to touch on are worthy of hours of consideration and thinking and brain picking. Virtual currencies, new models of financial intermediation, and artificial intelligence, no less. Now, some of these innovations have already found their way into your normal way of life, through your wallets, if you have anything like a wallet anymore, your smartphones that you have, I'm sure, and the financial systems that we all use. But that is only the beginning. Some of these innovations will just escalate. So, ready to jump on the pod? Let's explore the future together. As one of your fellow Londoners, Mary Poppins, might have said, bring along a pinch of imagination. So let us start with the virtual currencies. And to be clear, this is not to talk about digital payments in existing currencies through PayPal or other e-money providers such as Alipay in China or M-Pesa in Kenya. Virtual currencies are in a different category because they provide their own unit of account and payment systems. And these systems allow for peer-to-peer transactions without central clearinghouses, without central banks. For now, virtual currencies such as Bitcoins pose little or no challenge to the existing order of fiat currencies and central banks. Now, why is that? Because they're too volatile, too risky, too energy incentive, and because the underlying technologies are not yet scalable enough. And many are too opaque for regulators, and some have been hacked. But many of these are technological challenges that could be addressed over time. Not so long ago, some experts argued that personal computers would never be adopted. And some people even contended that tablets would be used to carry coffee around. So I think it may not be wise to just altogether dismiss virtual currencies. For instance, think of countries with weak institutions and unstable national currencies. Instead of adopting the currency of another country, say the US, for lack of a better example, some of these economies might see a growing use of virtual currencies. Let's call it dollarization 2.0. IMF experience shows that there is a tipping point beyond which coordination around a new currency is exponential. I know it's a small island, but it happened in the Seychelles, where our staff was very happy to do a lot of technical work, by the way. Dollarization jumped from 20% in 2006 to 60% in 2008. Tipping point. And yet, why might citizens hold virtual currencies rather than those physical dollars, physical euros, or physical sterlings? Because it may one day be easier and safer than obtaining paper bills, especially in remote regions. and because virtual currencies could actually become more stable. For instance, they could be issued one for dollars, or a stable basket of currencies. I'll come to that later. Issuance could be fully transparent, governed by a credible, predefined rule, an algorithm that can be monitored, or even a smart rule that might reflect changing macroeconomic circumstances, the substance, content, and measurement of which could be artificially determined by intelligence, not artificially determined, but determined by artificial intelligence using a lot of mining data. So in many ways, virtual currencies might just give existing currencies and monetary policy a run for their money. The best response by central bankers is to continue running effective monetary policy while being open to fresh ideas, new demands, new technologies as economies and technologies evolve. So while I completely agree with Minouche that you don't swim twice in the same water, yet you have to be aware that the waters are likely to change, and central banks have to adapt to those changes. For example, consider the growing demand for new payment services in countries where the shared, decentralized service economy is taking off. This is an economy rooted in peer-to-peer transactions, in frequent small-value payments, often across borders. Again, we are in 2040. $4 for gardening tips from a lady in New Zealand. €3 for an expert translation of a Japanese poem. And 80 pence for a virtual rendering of historic Fleet Street. These payments can be made by credit cards and other forms of e-money, but the charges are relatively high for small value transactions, especially across borders. Instead, citizens may one day prefer virtual currencies, since they potentially offer the same cost and convenience as cash, no settlement risks, no clearing delays, no central registration, no intermediary to check accounts and identities. If privately issued currencies remain risky and unstable, citizens may even call on central banks to provide digital forms of legal tender. So when the new service economy comes knocking on the Bank of England's door, will you welcome it inside? Will you serve tea? Or will you offer financial liquidity? Or all of the above? That brings me to the second leg of our journey into the future. New models of financial intermediation. One possibility is the breakup or unbundling of banking services. In the future, we might keep minimal balances for payment services on electronic wallets. The remaining balances may be kept in mutual funds or invested in peer-to-peer lending platforms with an edge in big data and artificial intelligence for automatic credit scoring. Actually, we don't need to be in 2040 for that. It's happening in some corners of the world already. This is a world of 6 months product development cycles and constant updates, primarily of software, with a huge premium on simple user interfaces and trusted security. A world where data is king. Or shall I say, mining is king. A world of many new players without imposing branch offices and the bricks and mortars that have been resuscitated. Now, some would argue that this puts a question mark on the fractional banking model we know today. If there are fewer banks deposits and money flows into the economy through new channels, how will those business models be built? What will the banks rely upon? And will they look like what they are today? Today's central banks typically affect asset prices through primary dealers or big banks to which they provide liquidity at fixed prices, so-called open market operations. But if these banks were to become less relevant in the new financial world and demand for central bank balances were to diminish, could monetary policy transmission remain as effective? If anything, central banks may well have to increase the number of counterparties to their operations, which I know some central banks are actively considering, such as the Bank of England, leading the way by including large broker-dealers and central counterparty clearings houses. Now, all this, of course, has regulatory implications. More counterparties imply more firms falling under the central bank's regulatory umbrella, which is the price to pay for liquidity on a rainy day. And there will be such rainy days. Still, better regulating shadow banks looks all the more pressing. The FSB, under your leadership, Mark, has already made huge progress in this area, and I hope will continue doing so. The remit of central banks, I contend, will actually grow. And with it, perhaps, public scrutiny and political pressure because of the accountability principle that was mentioned by the previous panel. Independence, at least to set monetary policy, will need further defenses and require even clearer and more courageous communication. We may also see a shift in regulatory practices. Traditionally, regulators have focused on overseeing well-defined entities. License for a bank. The bank was an entity. But as new service providers come on stream in new shapes and forms, fitting these into buckets may not be so easy. Think of a social media company that is offering payment services without actually managing an active balance sheet. What label do you stick on that? Is it a bank? Some kind of service provider? Now, all of this, I can assure you, is very fertile ground for lawyers, but not so good for regulators. The regulators will likely have to further expand their focus from financial entities, as we know it today, to financial activities, as has been explored with shadow banking. And I bet that it will go even further than where it is now. While at the same time possibly becoming experts in assessing the soundness and security of algorithms. Easier said than done. To make things smoother, at least a bit, the least we need is dialogue between experienced regulators and those regulators that are just beginning to tackle fintech, between policymakers, investors, and financial service firms, and between countries. And there may well be people that will be welcome at those tables that you described, Adam, that will not look like central bankers at all, but who will bring their wealth of expertise and will be a source of intelligence for the regulators. So reaching across borders will be critical as the focus of regulation widens from national entities to borderless activities, relying on alternative and new technologies. Moving from your local bank branch that we're used to quantum encrypted global transactions. Now that's a fascinating area, and that's one where clearly the IMF and our teams are very excited to do some analytical work, some soul-searching, brainstorming, but also gathering our members around the table in those sort of discrete and confidential form in order to explore the boundaries and understand exactly what that future could look like, as if we knew, but more importantly, what security rules, what new regulations will be required in the future. Talking of mandate, we too have that mandate for economic and financial stability. And while I don't think that we need to enlarge the mandate to actually address those macro-critical areas, neither do we need to increase or enlarge the mandate to actually capture those new technologies and the new set of rules that go with it. The stakes and gains from cooperation are high. None of us wants a hole in the global financial safety net, however much it gets stretched and reshaped. And I'm convinced that we at the IMF have a role to play in cooperation with others. We're not going to be leading that charge. We're going to cooperate. And certainly, the special drawing right, invented a few decades ago, might have a future interesting life if we include a digital dimension and some new technologies to it, particularly at a time when threats to existing networks are in the air. That brings me to my third and final leg, the transformative effect of artificial intelligence. As I said, I'm touching on those topics which really would warrant a lot more. Will our governor in 2040 walk into the bank to polish a monetary policy setting machine? Will your prediction, Andy, of 15 million jobs being automated in the UK affect the bank and its world-class staff? Well, one thing is clear. We always have more data. Some estimates suggest that actually 90% of the data that we use at the moment have been generated only in the last 2 years. And this is not just information on output, unemployment and prices, but also behavioral data on the quirks and irrationalities of the Homo economicus. Thanks to the smartphones and the internet, this data is now abundant, ubiquitous, and increasingly valuable as we pair it with artificial intelligence. As I said, mining will be king. Artificial intelligence is taking immense strides. Over the past years, some of the world's best players of Go, the game Go, that ancient board game, those best players have actually lost to a self-learning computer. And for many, that day of reckoning was supposed to be decades away. The machine learned tactics, recognized patterns, and optimized its game better than humans could. Now, clearly, the economy, particularly the global economy, is vastly more complex than a game of Go. But over the next generation, machines will almost certainly play a much larger role in assisting policymakers, offering real-time forecasts, spotting bubbles, and uncovering complex macro-financial links. But I believe, and I think we would all like to believe, that humans will still be needed. Or to paraphrase Albert Einstein, I can resolve any difficult problem, but I cannot figure out the madness of man. So there is an immense uncertainty, madness apart, about the economy anyway. Changes in basic economic relationships need to be spotted and risks evaluated. Judgment and constant questioning by peers, diversity of opinions, and even a few maverick spirits will remain essential to good policy. But what if the machines could actually do all of that? We'll find out. But will we trust the machines? That's the point that was made by Minouche during the previous panel. Will trust and technology go hand in hand? Or will they be just a short step away from the accident that will undermine all that? Next is the question of communication. Good monetary policy, as we know, is about communication and courageous communication. Policy is going to be effective if it can be clearly explained to the public so that they can form expectation about future policy, as Augustine was saying earlier on. Could machines really explain their decisions in plain English? And more to the point, could they be trusted? And will they be accountable? Even if that hurdle could be overcome. That issue of communication. The issue of responsibility and accountability is not yet resolved. Suffice to say that lawyers are struggling at the moment with the driverless automobile causing the accident, who will bear the cost? Who is ultimately responsible? Which portion of the design attributed to which constructor? A minefield for lawyers. The solution we don't have yet. And accountability is key. I couldn't agree more with the previous panel. Without accountability, we cannot have independence. How else to bestow so much power in, after all, what is, no matter how talented they are, a technocratic organization? And without independence, policy is bound to go astray, as this conference reminds us loud and clear. So no, for my own money, I do not see monetary policy being taken over by the machines. In 2040, the governor of the bank will be of flesh and bones. And behind the door, she will find real people. Probably the best and the brightest. And some of the more trivial tasks might be handled by machines. And there will always be an old lady living in Threadneedle Street. And actually, I hope you agree with me, but it can be not so unpleasant to speak to a lady of a certain age. So as our pod journey comes to an end, some of you may wonder about my upbeat tone. For many, this new world of central banking is less of Mary Poppins and more Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, much like the one he describes. Yes, I could have talked to you about cybersecurity and the challenges and the hacking and the financing of terrorism and the hiding places that are made available. But I believe that we as individuals and communities have the capacity to shape a technological and economic future that works for all. I'd like to pause for a second here. We go around beating our chest, reminding ourselves that when globalization was up and rising and the story of the day, we forgot a little bit about the fact that it had to benefit all. Let's try not to make the same mistake over again. And as difficult as it is, as jargonic as it sounds, as technical as it certainly is, let us make sure that these new technologies, in the way in which they disrupt and transform, will actually work for all, and not just for a few. Failing which, in 2050, 10 years later, we might be very sorry that we have not reminded ourselves of that imperative. That is why I prefer Shakespeare's evocation of that brave new world in The Tempest. Forgive the accent. Oh, wonder, how many goodly creatures are there here? How beauteous mankind is. Oh, brave new world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christine, for taking us on that fascinating journey in your time machine to this brave new world. We've got time for a few questions, I think, and while I'm collecting those, maybe I can kick us off. You told a tale, a very compelling story about these digital disruptors nipping away at the heels of the existing incumbents. I just wondered how we, as central banks, especially central banks like the Bank of England, that have responsibility for supervising and safeguarding the financial system, how should we respond to this digital disruption?
You know what I've heard attending this great conference is that there is a strong anchoring in the mandate. And I think the mandate is critically important to actually define where the central banks will operate, and whether it's essentially price stability or price stability and prosperity, or price stability and financial stability, primary, secondary objective. I think that's really where institutions need to sort of have their roots and have their anchoring. And then from there on, as I was saying in my remarks, going beyond the entities that you typically have authority over, supervision over, regulatory power over, I think looking at the activities undertaken by any entity is going to be critically important, which is why I think that the ambit of central banks is going to expand beyond the limits that it has at the moment. I think that's point number one. Point number two, I think the openness of the central banks to funny hybrid things that will be doing some of the current banking activities as we know it, but not all of it, should also be in the cards so that you actually capture the various activities. And they are already developing development of those hybrid instruments. I would also say that the point that I made about the dialogue, I think, is critically important. The ability of a central bank to open its windows, open its doors to what is being done, how it is being done, and by whom it is being done is critically important. So I know that, for instance, the Bank of England, as I understand, is going out itself and explaining its duty, mandate, and the purpose of its institution across the country. I think equally important is to actually open the windows and to let people in who will actually be able to explain to you and me how their design, how their application, how their channels of transmissions actually function. And by having that dialogue, being better in capacity of, as I said, capturing the activity, I think is also really important. In Luxembourg, in Belgium, for instance, they refer to the sandbox concept. I know this is the case as well in this country, whether by you or by the CFA, but it's small, it's in development, but being with them and seeing how it's transforming the whole sector is very very important.
And one of the, I think, fascinating expressions you used in the talk was this notion of a borderless activity as distinct from a sort of bordered entity. And taking that on, presumably, if we are indeed, as it sounds plausible, moving to this world of borderless activities, that must presumably strengthen the case for us being coordinated and joined up internationally when it comes to getting our arms around regulating and supervising those borderless activities.
Yeah, and in a way that has begun.
Yeah.
When you have all these discussions about the home country and the host country and what part of the regulation applies and how you segment the activity and where you expect the reserves to be and the capital and so on and so forth. But I think it's actually moving one or two steps further than purely home host, because at least in the home host you have entities, either legal or branches of existing legal entities. So you have a way to sort of put your arms around these animals. Cross-border transfers supported by digital technologies will be far more difficult to apprehend, and I think will require rethinking of the regulatory environment and the legal rules under which it will be defined. Because clearly there is a division of labor in some countries between what is actually securities and what is deposit, to put it at the most simplistic way. And that border might very well be less obvious and decisive than it is at the moment.
Perfect. Let's go to the audience, given that time is... Can you start at the front with Manoush?
Can I, while the mic is coming, I just want to, I'd like to make one additional point. I think it's going to be, what's happening at the moment, if you look at the sort of, the economy of that market, assuming that the financial activities can be defined as a market, I think it's a very particular market, which is associated with guarantees and with exorbitant privilege, certainly for some currencies. But what's happening is a massive disruption in the making, caused by innovations or compounded innovations. And as in any market disruptions, there will be innovation, there will be productivity improvements, and there will be, sort of shock to the existing business models, to which current institutions and entities will be trying to resist, either by trying to build, territories, trying to raise barrier to entry, trying to seek protection from the central bank, for instance, or else, rather than be cannibalized themselves, they will want to cannibalize.
We're seeing that.
I don't know how you put it in English, but instead of being cannibalized by others, they will cannibalize themselves by actually moving in that field of digital world, including virtual currencies. So I think it's really important for central banks to not play that game of please protect our turf, failing which we could cause a risk to financial stability. I think there is a trade-off between financial stability, which would be part of the mandate, or price stability, rather, and lending an excessive protectionist arm to those who are under competition because of that disruption.
I completely agree. I mean, we've seen plenty of destructive destruction in finance. It'd be nice to have some creative as well, actually, and that speaks exactly to your point. Manoush.
Christine, I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the role of the IMF's special drawing rights. In the original vision of Keynes and Bretton Woods, they thought that the SDR would play a much bigger role in the international monetary system. Do you think the digital age creates an opportunity to rethink the role of the SDR as an international currency?
This is really open territory here because it has been around for a long time. There were high expectations. There were actually issuance in special drawing rights for a period of time. Then it was abandoned. There was a pickup lately after the renminbi was included in the basket of currencies. Has it been a massive pickup? No. I think the digital platform and the distributed ledger technologies can actually facilitate something which will otherwise be of a political nature. And I think if the two were to come together, the digital acceleration and facilitation and the geopolitical situation that would be propitious to relying on an alternative basket of currencies that would not be a substitute for existing international currency is, so she says with a question mark. But I think we would need the two together. It's not a far-fetched hypothetical. And I believe that at the fund we just have to be ready for that, should the circumstances arise that would facilitate the whole process.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more questions, which one will be Marcus just here, and then one more I'll take from the floor. Yeah.
In a famous speech in 2005, Raghu Rajan warned that financial innovation could make the world a riskier place. And the reason I think he focused on was the asymmetries of information between buyers and sellers. This theme was picked up by Akerlof and Schiller in their book called, one might call it, Fishing for the Future, where they forecast that basically those with more information will exploit those with less. So does this not offer a very important role for financial banks and regulators in protecting those who have less information from those who have more?
I agree with you that although price stability is going to be, for most central banks, the sort of primary and decisive mandate, although for some not the only one, the protection of the consumer financial services, and in particular those who do not have access to information, is a subset of that mandate, not expressly spelt out as is probably, but what is the purpose of price stability if it is not to protect the consumers, the depositors, and the economic agents? So ultimately, it is actually the fate of people which central bankers have in their hands when it comes to economic and financial matters. So I completely agree with you, which I think touches on the point that I was trying to make concerning communication. And that communication imperative, coupled with this ultimate goal to protect and help those who have no access or no understanding, I think is made even more critical because of the technology barrier that is created by the current developments as we see them and at the speed at which we see them.
Thank you. And Diane, with the final question, I think, just to...
Thank you. I found it a fascinating talk, and it reminded me of a time I've spent in China recently, where everyone is using Alipay and other things on their iPhones. It's only the foreigners who use currency there. It caused me to wonder whether in your world of digital currencies, which are provided by private peer-to-peer type organizations like Alipay or PayPal, will monetary policy work at all? You know, the people in your central bank might well sit around a table and decide what interest rates should be, but would it have any impact at all if currencies are indeed global and instantaneous information adjusts exchange rates instantaneously? We could be back in a world where exchange rate targeting in some way, shape, or form will become necessary, because that's the only thing where markets will actually make decisions about the soundness or not of individual countries. This is not a very well expressed question, but I'm just wondering whether monetary policy itself will disappear in that world.
I think if we were to put the questions to the central bankers who are sitting at the front row and beyond, they would all say yes, that will be needed. I would suppose that in the more immediate future, it makes their job probably more necessary and more difficult because of that sort of segmentation of the banking relationship and the fact that whether it's digital support or whether it's just pure segmentation of the customer relationship versus the availability of services, that they have to sort of capture the whole of that segmented relationship. But going forward, who will set the price of money and who will assess time? Because that's really what it boils down to. I contend that we will still need monetary policy, but future will tell. O que sera, sera, they would say.
And that's a fine note, I think, on which to
By the way, I want to share an anecdote with you. Because, I think it was just fascinating. Many of us actually read about or just go to China and understand that nobody carries a wallet anymore. Most people have not seen a renminbi banknote in months, and most of them do not carry credit cards either. And the unique instrument of payment is their phone. I was told this morning by one of our former IMF alumni that he was in China, he was just coming back from China, and was told exactly the story that you told us and that I'm repeating. He said, but this guy who's not been using either a wallet nor a credit card in 2 weeks walks down the streets and bumps into a beggar who is obviously begging for a bit of money. Is he pulling out a banknote? Is he handing out a cap? No. Putting his cell phone to the guy who's walking down the streets.
We should probably bring things to a close, Christine.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
think it's safer.
On that note, listen, we've heard a lot about the fintech revolution, which I'm sure is coming. And the fintech disruptors might well eat the lunch of the banking incumbents tomorrow, but they won't eat our lunch today, because that's out the back. We're returning here at 1:30. And to Christine, thank you so much on the food theme for serving up such enormous food for thought to us, a real feast on what might lie ahead over not just the next 20 years, but the next 23 at least. Thank you, and please join me and thanking Christine in the usual way.